Chapter 11. Reports of my death greatly exaggerated. Gulab had now become a principal figure in my life. He called the security shots, made sure I had food and water, and was, in my mind, the link between us and his father as the old man toiled through the mountains to Asadabad. The Afghani policeman betrayed no signs of stress, but he did reveal to me that a letter had been received earlier from the commander of the Taliban forces. It was a written demand that the villagers of Sabra hand over the American immediately. The demand came from the rising officer of the Taliban army in the northeast, the firebrand Commander Abdul, a right-hand man to Sharmak and a character who plainly saw himself as some kind of eastern Che Carrera, his reputation apparently growing as an ambush leader and as an officer who was an expert at bringing new recruits through the passes. I never knew, but it would not have surprised me to learn that he had been in the front line of the army that confronted the team on the ridge, though I have no doubt the strategy was planned by the senior man Sharmak, who had done so much damage already. They did not, however, faze Gulab. He and his father had replied that it made no difference how bad the Taliban wanted the American, they were not going to get him. When Gulab told me, he made a very distinct, brave, dismissive gesture, and he spent a lot of time trying to convey his personal position. They can't frighten me. My village is well armed, and we have our own laws and rights. The Taliban need our support a lot more than we need theirs. He was a gallant and confident man, at least on the surface, but I noticed he took no chances when there was any kind of suggestion the Taliban were coming in. I guess that's why we ended up sleeping on the roof. Also, he had not the slightest interest in a reward. I offered to give him my watch in return for his unending decency to me. I implored him to take my watch, because it was all I had to offer, because he always refused to accept it. As for the money, what use could that have been to him? There was nothing to spend it on, no shop. Nearest town miles and miles away, a journey had to be made on foot. A couple of the sneering kids did ask for money, teenagers, maybe 16 or 17 years old. They were planning to join the Taliban and leave Sabra to fight for freedom. Gulab told me he had no intention of leaving here, and I understood that. He was part of the fabric of this village. One day he would be the village elder. His family would grow up here. It was all he'd ever known, all he'd ever wanted. This very beautiful corner of the Hindu Kush was where he belonged. What use was the money to Muhammad Gulab Sabra? The last of my kids had left the room, and I was lying there contemplating the world, when there was a kick at the door that nearly took it off its hinges. No one kicks in a door quite like that, except the Taliban raiding party. That was all I could imagine, but around here, where doors don't fit, a good bang with your sandal is about the only way to get the son of a bitch open, short of full-blood shoulder charge. But the sudden shock of the door being kicked in about 5 feet from your head is a nerve-wracking experience. I'm a neurotic about it to this day, because the sound of that crash of the door is the sound I heard before I was tortured. It sometimes dominates my dreams. I wake up sweating, a tremendous crash echoing in my mind, and no matter where I am, I need to check the door lock before I can sleep again. It's pretty goddamn inconvenient at times. Anyway, this was not the Taliban. It was just my own guys opening the door, which must have been shut firmly by the kids. I restarted my heart, and my room stayed kind of quiet until mid-morning, when the door catapulted open with a violent bang that shook the goddamn mountain, never mind the room. And once more I almost jumped out of my Afghan jumpsuit. And this time they were shouting at me. I could not understand but something had broken out. Things were on the move. Jesus Christ. I had to steady this group down. They were adults, kids, all mixed up, and they were yelling the same thing. Parachute, 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 Dr. Marcus, come quick. I made my way outside, aching to high heaven all the way. I resolved to have another shot of opium as soon as I returned, but for now it was all eyes upward, straight up at the clear blue, cloudless skies. What could we see? Nothing. Whatever had landed was down, and I stood there trying to make them understand I needed to know if there had been a man at the end of the parachute. If so, how many parachutes there had been. Was this a drop zone for my buddies to come right in and get me? The upshot of this was also nothing. The tribesmen simply could not understand me. The kids, who I detected were the ones who actually spotted the parachute or parachutes, were just as mystified. All hours of study we had done together had come to nothing. There was a sudden conference. Most of the adults upped and left. I went back in. They returned 15 minutes later and brought with them all my gear, which they had hidden away from the eyes of the Taliban. They gave me back my rifle and ammunition, my H gear, that's my harness, in its pocket, my PRC-148 inter-squad radio, the one for which I had lost, the little microphone earpiece, and still had a weakish battery and still operational emergency beacon. I was aware that if I grabbed the bull by the horns and went right outside and let rip this communications gear, I would once more be a living, breathing distress signal, which Americans might catch from a cruising helo. On the other hand, the Taliban, hidden all around the hills, could scarcely miss me. I found this a bit of a dilemma. But the rearmament guys of Sabre also brought me my laser and disposable camera. I grabbed my rifle and held it like you might caress a returning lover. This was the weapon God had granted me and, so far as I could tell, still wanted me to have. We traveled a long way together, and I probably deserve some kind of award for mountain climbing, maybe the Grand Prix of Hindu Kush presented by to Sherpa Marcus. Sorry, forget all that. I meant mountain falling. The Grand Prix Hindu Crash, awarded unanimously to Sherpa Marcus the Unsteady. Outside, I put on my harness, locked and loaded the rifle, and prepared for whatever hell might await us. But with my harness back on, I was not yet done with the kids. The harness contained my notebook. We had access to the village ballpoint pen. I marched them back into the house and carefully drew 2 parachutes on the page. I drew a man swinging down from the first one. On the second one, I drew a box. I showed them pictures to the kids and asked them which one, and about 20 little fingers shot forward, all aimed directly at the parachute with a box. Beautiful, I had intel. There had been some kind of supply drop, and since the local tribesmen did not either use aircraft or parachutes, those supplies had to be American. They also had to be aimed at the remnants of my team. Everyone else was dead. I was that remnant. I asked the kids exactly where the chutes had dropped, and they just pointed to the mountain. They got into gear and raced out there, I guess to try and show me. I stood outside and watched them go, still a bit baffled. Had my buddies somehow found me? Had the old man reached Asadabad? Either way, it was one hell of a coincidence that the Americans had made a supply drop a few hundred yards away from where I was taking cover. The mountains were endless, and I could have been anywhere. I went back to the house to rest my leg and talk for a while with Gulab. He had not seen the parachute drop, and had no idea for how long the road his father had journeyed. In my mind, I knew the very active combat soldier knows the Napoleon's army advanced on Moscow at 1 mile every 15 minutes with full packs and muskets. That's 4 miles an hour, right? That way, the village elder should have made it maybe in 11 hours, except for 2 mitigating factors. He was about 200 years old, and, from where I stood, the mountain he was crossing had a gradient slightly steeper than the Washington Monument, and if the VE made it by Ramadan 2008, I'd be kind of lucky. 1 hour later, there it goes. Bang, the goddamn door went off like a bomb. Even Gulab jumped, but not as high as I did. In came the kids, accompanied by a group of adults. They carried with them a white document, which must have looked like a snowball in the coal mine up here where the word litter simply does not exist. I took it from them and realized it was an instruction pamphlet for a cell phone. Where the hell did you get this? I asked them. Right out there, Dr. Marcus, right out there. Everyone was pointing at the mountainside. I had no trouble with the translation. Parachute, I said. Yes, Dr. Marcus, yes, parachute. I sent them right out there again, trying to make it clear that I needed the mountainside search for anything like this, anything that might have come in the parachutes. My guys don't drop cell phone pamphlets, but they might have been dropping me a cell phone, and a pamphlet just came with it. Either way, I could not find out for myself, so I had to get the guys to do it for me. Gulab stayed, but the others went with the kids, like a golf crowd fanned out to look for Tiger's ball in the deep rough. Gulab and I settled in. We had a cup of tea and some delicious little candies, then lounged back on our big cushions. Suddenly, bang! The door nearly cannoned off its hinges. I shot tea all over the rug, and in came everyone again. This time they had found a 5590 radio battery and an MRE, meal ready to eat. The guys must have thought I was starving, correct. But the battery did not fit my PRC-148 radio, which sucked, because if it had, I could have fired up a permanent distress signal into the sky above the village. As things were, I had no idea if my present weak radio beacon would reach much higher than the rooftops. I had no need to interrogate the kids further. If there had been anything else there on their mountain, they would have found it. There obviously wasn't. Whatever the drop had contained, the Taliban had beaten the kids to it. The one bit of reverse good news was they clearly had the cell phone or phones, and they were probably trying to use them. And the entire U.S. electronic surveillance system in the province of Kunar would be listening, ready to locate the caller. But then I noticed something which made my blood boil. Almost every one of the kids had been battered. They had bruises on their faces, cut lips, and bloody noses. Those little pricks out there had beaten up my kids, punched them in their faces, to stop them from getting the stuff from the drop. There is no end to lengths that these people will go to win this war. And I'll never forget what they did to the kids of Sabre. I spent the rest of the day patching them up, all those little brave guys trying not to cry. I had nearly wiped the entire contents of Sarway's medical bag. Whenever I hear the word Taliban, I think of that day first. More strategically, it did seem to the American military believe there was at least one SEAL still alive down here. The question was, what now? No one wanted to risk sending in another MH-47 helicopter, since the Taliban seemed to have become very adroit at knocking them down. Mind you, they have a lot of practice, right back from when they were using those old Stinger missiles to knock the Russians out of the sky. And we all knew the danger point was landing. When the ramp was down, ready for insert, that's when the mountain men aimed the RPG straight into the back to explode the right fuel tank area. And I guess the U.S. flight crews could never be sure of any Afghan village who might be in it, what weapons they had, and how skilled they might be at using them. I knew they'd need a pretty good aerial group to soften this place up before they could come in and get me, and I was desperate to give them some kind of guide. I rigged up my radio emergency beacon to transmit through the open window. I had no idea how much battery I had left, so I just turned it on, aimed it high, and left it there on the window ledge, hopefully pinpointing my whereabouts to any overhead flights by the Air Force or Night Stalkers. To my surprise, U.S. reaction happened a whole lot quicker than I thought it would. That afternoon, the U.S. Air Force came thundering in, dropping 1,200-pound bombs on the mountainside beyond the village, right where the Taliban had picked up the stuff of the from the parachute drop. The blasts were incredible. In my house, well, I thought the whole building was coming down. Rocks and dust cascaded into the room. One of the walls sustained a major structural fault as the blast after blast shook the mountain from top to bottom. Outside, people were screaming as the bombs hit and exploded. Thatch roofs were blown. There was a dust storm outside. Mothers and kids were rushing for cover, and tribesmen were at a complete loss. Everyone had heard of an American air power, but they had not seen it firsthand like this. In fact, none of the bombs, I guess by design, hit Sabre. But they came close, damn close, all around the perimeter. There must have been a big lesson right there, a very simple one. If you allow the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to make camp in and around your village, no good could possibly come of it. However, there wasn't much comfort to my villagers as they tried to clean up the mess, rebuild the walls and roofs, and calm down frightened kids, most of them who had had a very bad day, all because of me. And I looked out at the havoc around me and felt the most terrible sadness. And Gulab understood what I was feeling. He came over and put his arm around me and said, "Ah, Dr. Marcus, Taliban very bad. We know. We fight." Jesus, just what I need, a brand new battle. We both retreated into the house and sat down for a while, trying to plot a course for me, which would cause the least possible trouble to the farmers of Sabre. It seemed apparent that my presence here was causing more and more threatening attitude from the Taliban, and the last thing I wanted was to cause pain and unhappiness among these people who had sheltered me. But my options were narrow, despite the American being, it seemed, hot on my trail. One of the main problems was that Gulab's father had not made contact with us, because there was no way he could, and we had no way of knowing whether he had made it to the military base. The Taliban were probably not overwhelmingly thrilled at being bombed by the U.S. Air Force, and probably sustained many casualties out there on the mountain. It occurred both to Gulab and me the word revenge might not be far from the curled lips of those hate-filled Muslim fanatics, that I might be the most convenient target. This meant a major problem and probably loss of life for the people of Sabre. Gulab himself was under pressure since he'd received a threat from the Taliban. He had a wife, children, and many relatives to think about. In the end, the decision made itself. Clearly, I had to leave, just to keep the village from becoming a battleground. Lo-Hai had worked well, but we both wondered if the mystical tribal folklore could hold out indefinitely in the face of the wounded and somewhat embarrassed Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters. The U.S. bombardment of the mountainside had for a while raised my hopes and expectations. After all, here were my own guys swooping over the tribesmen from the Middle Ages, hitting them hard with high-tech modern ordnance. That's got to be good, right? But not everything's good. Retribution, against me and my protectors, was now uppermost in my mind. I think it was the tight-fisted old oil baron John Paul Getty who once observed that for every plus that takes place in the world, there is, somewhere, somehow, a minus. He got that right. The question was, where should I go? And here my options were very limited. I could never make the long walk to the base in Asadabad, and anyhow that would seem insane since the village elder was either in there or very nearly, and the only place of refuge close by was the U.S. outpost at Montague, 2 miles away over a steep mountain. I did not relish that plan, and neither would the guides who would need to assist me on the journey, but so far as Gulab and I could tell, there was nothing else we could do except hunker down and prepare for a Taliban attack, and I really did not want to put anyone through that, especially the kids. We thus resolved that I should walk with him and 2 others over the mountain to the village of Montague, which sounds Irish but is strictly Pashtun and is cooperative with the U.S. military. The plan was to wait until long after dark and then slip into the high pastures around 11 o'clock, stealthily passing right under the noses of the probably sleeping Taliban watchmen. I could only hope my left leg would stand up to the journey. I'd lost a ton of weight, but I was still a very big guy to be carried halfway by a couple slender Afghan tribesmen, most of whom were 5'8" and 110 pounds, soaked to the skin. But Gulab did not seem worried. We settled down to wait out the long dark hours before 11, when we could make our break. Night fell quite abruptly, as it does here in the peaks when the sun finally slips behind them. We lit no lanterns, offered no clue to the Taliban. We just sat there in the dark, sipping tea, and waiting for the right moment to leave. Suddenly, right out of the blue, there was the most colossal thunderstorm. The rain came swiftly, lashing rain, driving over the sideways over the mountain. It was a rain like you rarely see, the kind of stuff that usually identified with hurricanes that keep replaying on the Weather Channel.